They lived in wealth, power, and luxury. But not all of them escaped the horrors of the war. Some were wives. Others were mistresses. And their fates were darker than history ever reveals. In this video, we uncover the shocking stories of Hitler's, Goebbels, and Göring's women. Secrets that the world rarely hears.
April 30, 1945, 3:15 p.m., Berlin, Germany. The ground trembles as Soviet artillery hammers the city without mercy. Dust shakes loose from cracked ceilings deep beneath the Reich Chancellery. In the bunker corridors, electric lights flicker. The air smells of damp concrete, cigarette smoke, and the metallic scent of fear. Somewhere above, Berlin is burning. Footsteps echo down the narrow hallway. A door opens quietly. Inside a small room, a young woman sits at a wooden table. Her hands are steady, but her eyes are hollow with exhaustion. Moments earlier, she married the most powerful man in Nazi Germany. Now she waits outside the door. Whispers move through the bunker like ghosts. Officers speak in low voices. Secretaries shuffle papers. Someone pours another glass of brandy. The war is ending. Everyone knows it. The woman at the table is Eva Braun. For years she lived in the shadows of power, rarely photographed beside the men she loved, rarely mentioned in public, yet closer to the center of the Nazi Empire than almost anyone else. History remembers the generals, the battles, the armies. But behind many of the most powerful figures of the Third Reich stood women whose lives were tied to that brutal system, wives, companions, and mistresses who lived in luxury while Europe burned. Some were loyal to the bitter end, some tried to escape, some vanished into quiet obscurity after the war, and some paid a terrible price. They were sometimes called, half-jokingly, the Nazi princesses. Not because they wore crowns, but because they lived like royalty inside a dictatorship built on fear. Far from the front lines, far from the bombed cities and starving civilians, the private world of the Nazi elite existed in strange contrast to the devastation spreading across Europe. High in the Bavarian Alps, the mountain retreat known as the Berghof overlooked miles of pristine snow and forests. Here, Adolf Hitler spent long stretches of the war surrounded by a circle of trusted companions. Among them was Eva Braun. To the German public, Hitler cultivated the image of a solitary leader, married only to Germany. His propaganda carefully avoided revealing any romantic life. A dictator devoted entirely to the nation appeared stronger, more mythic, but behind closed doors, Eva Braun was always nearby. She was young, cheerful, and fascinated with photography and film. She shot home movies of relaxed afternoons on the Berghof terrace, officers laughing, guests sipping coffee, dogs running through the grass. The scenes look almost peaceful, almost normal, but those images were recorded while the regime she lived inside was orchestrating some of the darkest crimes in modern history. Eva Braun had first met Hitler in 1929. She was just 17 years old, working as an assistant in a Munich photography shop owned by Heinrich Himmler, Hitler's personal photographer. The future dictator, then already a rising political figure, noticed the quiet young woman. Their relationship developed slowly, and mostly in secret. For years, Eva Braun lived in the background of Hitler's life, rarely acknowledged publicly. Yet privately she became deeply attached to him, even attempting suicide twice during the early years of their relationship when she felt neglected. Eventually, Hitler allowed her a place in his private world, but she was never permitted to influence politics. Never allowed to appear publicly as a partner. Her role was companionship. Escape. A reminder of normal life in a regime that was anything but normal, and she was not alone. Across Nazi Germany, other powerful men built similar private worlds around themselves. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and one of the most flamboyant figures in the regime, lived in extraordinary luxury with his wife Emmy Göring, a former actress who became something like the unofficial First Lady of Nazi Germany. Their estate, Karen Hall, was filled with priceless art, extravagant halls, and lavish parties attended by the political elite. Then there was Magda Goebbels, wife of propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. Elegant, composed, and fiercely loyal to Hitler, Magda became one of the most visible women in the Nazi hierarchy. Newspapers portrayed her as the ideal German mother, raising 6 blonde-haired children in perfect devotion to the Reich, but behind that carefully constructed image lay tensions, scandals, and a fanatical loyalty that would eventually lead her to one of the most shocking decisions of the entire war. Elsewhere stood Lena Heydrich, wife of Reinhard Heydrich, one of the most feared architects of the Nazi security state and a key organizer of the Holocaust. Lena was not merely a passive observer of her husband's rise, she had been an early supporter of the Nazi movement, and proudly embraced the ideology that came with it. And then there were the Mistresses, women like Unity Mitford, the British aristocrat who became obsessed with Hitler and moved to Germany to join the inner circle of Nazi society. Or Winifred Wagner, the influential cultural figure and close confidant of Hitler who maintained her loyalty long after the war ended. These women lived in proximity to enormous power, but their fates would be shaped by a war that spiraled completely out of control. At first, life inside the Nazi elite seemed almost untouchable. Lavish dinners, private trains, mountain retreats, exclusive parties where generals and ministers discussed the future of Europe as if victory were inevitable. Yet by 1943, the illusion began to crack. German armies were retreating, cities were burning under Allied bombing raids, and slowly, the world around these women began to collapse. Some watched in disbelief, some clung to the ideology that had given them status and privilege. And some began to understand that when the Third Reich fell, their lives would never be the same again, because for the wives and companions of Nazi power, the end of the war would not simply mean defeat. It would mean judgment, and in some cases, a final, irreversible choice waiting inside a dark bunker beneath a ruined city. June 4, 1942, 10:42 a.m., Prague, Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. Morning sunlight spills across a quiet street. A black open Mercedes slows near a tight bend in the road. The engine hums gently. For a moment the scene feels calm. Then two men step from the sidewalk. One raises a submachine gun. The trigger is pulled. The weapon jams. For a single heartbeat the world freezes. Reinhard Heydrich rises from the back seat of the car, furious, reaching for his pistol. Then a grenade explodes beside the vehicle. The blast tears through metal and glass. Smoke fills the street. Civilians scatter in panic. One of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany collapses onto the pavement, gravely wounded. Miles away, his wife Lena Heydrich will soon receive the news that the men feared across occupied Europe has been attacked. The war is no longer distant from the private lives of the Nazi elite. It is moving closer. Lena Heydrich had believed strongly in the Nazi movement long before her husband rose to power. Friends later recalled that she supported the ideology even before Reinhard Heydrich joined the party. She encouraged his ambitions and proudly watched as his career inside the SS accelerated. Reinhard Heydrich eventually became one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi security system. As head of the Reich Main Security Office, he oversaw intelligence networks, secret police forces, and operations that terrorized occupied Europe. In 1942 he also played a central role in organizing the policies that would lead to the systematic murder of millions during the Holocaust. But in June of that year everything changed. After the assassination attempt in Prague, Heydrich initially seemed to survive the explosion. Doctors treated his injuries. For days it appeared he might recover, then infection set in. On June 4, 1942, Reinhard Heydrich died. Adolf Hitler declared him a martyr of the Reich. His funeral became a massive ceremony filled with black uniforms, banners, and military honors. Leaders of the Nazi state gathered to mourn one of their most feared colleagues, but when the ceremony ended and the crowds disappeared, Lena Heydrich faced a different reality. The protection that came from her husband's power was gone. She was now a widow in the middle of a brutal global war. Elsewhere inside the inner circle of Nazi leadership, another woman lived at the center of influence. Magda Goebbels. In official photographs she appeared calm and elegant, often surrounded by her 6 children. Their carefully styled hair and matching clothes made them symbols of the perfect German family promoted by Nazi propaganda, but the reality inside the Goebbels household was far more complicated. Magda had married Joseph Goebbels in 1931. Adolf Hitler attended the wedding and even served as a witness. The marriage quickly became part of the public image of the regime. Magda appeared frequently at official events and social gatherings. Newspapers praised her as the model mother of the Third Reich, yet behind the polished image there were serious tensions. Joseph Goebbels was known for numerous affairs. By the late 1930s, his relationship with a Czech actress caused a scandal inside the highest levels of Nazi leadership. Magda demanded a divorce. Hitler stepped in personally. The dictator insisted the marriage must continue because the regime needed the image of a perfect family at the top. A public separation would damage the propaganda narrative. So the marriage continued. Though many close to the family sensed that something had changed, Magda seemed increasingly devoted to Hitler himself. Some observers later believed her loyalty to the leader was even stronger than her loyalty to her husband. It was less a home and more a grand palace filled with priceless art and treasures gathered from across Europe. Many of those works had been taken from occupied territories and confiscated from collectors. Guests arriving at Karen Hall often described enormous halls, elaborate decorations, and long dining tables filled with expensive food and wine. It was a world that seemed strangely detached from the brutal conflict spreading across the continent. Emmy Göring embraced the public role that came with her husband's position. As a former actress, she felt comfortable in front of cameras and often appeared beside Hermann Göring during ceremonies and celebrations. But even this world of wealth could not escape the growing pressure of the war. By 1943, Allied bombing raids were reaching deep into Germany. Entire cities were struck by waves of bombers that turned neighborhoods into burning ruins. Military disasters followed. The defeat at Stalingrad shocked the Nazi leadership. German forces in North Africa surrendered. Allied armies invaded Italy. For the first time, many leaders inside the regime began to realize that victory might be impossible. Inside their private homes, the atmosphere slowly changed. Confidence faded. Fear replaced it. Eva Braun continued spending long periods at the Berghof in the Bavarian Alps. She filmed small moments of daily life with her movie camera. Friends laughing on the terrace. Officers drinking coffee. Dogs running through the grass. The images looked peaceful, but outside those mountains the war was spiraling toward catastrophe. Visitors often described Eva Braun as cheerful and sometimes surprisingly distant from the political decisions shaping the war. Yet she remained loyal to Adolf Hitler. As the military situation worsened, some officials quietly suggested that she leave Germany and move somewhere safe. She refused. A group of conspirators decided that removing Hitler might save the country from total destruction. On July 20, 1944, a bomb exploded inside Hitler's military headquarters in East Prussia. The dictator survived. The plot failed, but the message was clear: the regime was cracking from within. As the war entered its final months, many members of the Nazi elite began making quiet preparations. Some moved family members away from major cities. Others hid valuables or tried to create plans for escape. Yet a few women made a different choice. They would stay beside the men whose power had defined their lives, even as the front lines moved closer, even as German cities collapsed under bombing. Because far beneath the ruined streets of Berlin, a final chapter was already beginning to unfold. A chapter where loyalty, belief, and fear would collide inside a concrete bunker while the Third Reich slowly crumbled above them. April 28, 1945, 10:30 p.m., Führerbunker, Berlin. The bunker trembles as Soviet artillery slams into the city above. Dust drifts from the ceiling and settles across narrow corridors lit by weak electric lamps. The air smells of smoke, damp concrete, and exhaustion. Every explosion feels closer than the last. Berlin is collapsing. Deep underground, the final members of Adolf Hitler's inner circle move through the bunker halls in silence. Boots scrape across the floor. Papers rustle. Somewhere a radio crackles with fading reports from a front that no longer exists. Among those still inside is Eva Braun. For years she had lived quietly behind the scenes of the Nazi leadership. The German public rarely saw her. Photographs almost never showed her beside Hitler. Yet she had remained close to him through the rise of the Third Reich and the disasters that followed. Now she had been given the chance to escape. Several officials suggested she leave Berlin while it was still possible. A flight south toward the Alps might have saved her life. Eva Braun refused. To her, leaving meant abandoning the men she had followed for more than 15 years. She chose to remain inside the bunker as the Soviet army surrounded the capital. Witnesses later described the atmosphere during those final days as strange and tense. Outside the bunker, the city burned. Inside, Daily routines continued in small and fragile ways. Secretaries still typed documents, military officers still studied maps even though most of the units marked on them had already been destroyed or scattered. Meals were served in the small dining room though many people had little appetite. Eva Braun tried to keep the mood from collapsing completely. She spoke lightly with the staff, shared cigarettes, and occasionally laughed with the secretaries who had also decided to stay, yet everyone understood the truth. Germany had lost the war. Late on the night of April 28, a message reached the bunker that stunned Hitler. Heinrich Himmler, one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi regime, had secretly attempted to negotiate surrender terms with the Western Allies. Hitler exploded with anger when he heard the news. To him it was the ultimate betrayal. Trust inside the leadership circle was already fragile. Now it was shattered. Soon after, Hitler made a decision. In the early hours of April 29, a small civil ceremony took place inside a narrow room in the bunker. A few witnesses gathered quietly as the city above continued to collapse under bombardment. Eva Braun stood beside Adolf Hitler. They were married. For years she had been hidden from the public as his private companion. Now, for a single day, she officially became his wife. Shortly afterward, Hitler dictated his final political statement, blaming Germany's defeat on betrayal and enemies while refusing to accept responsibility for the war that had devastated Europe. Meanwhile, another woman inside the bunker was facing her own decision. Magda Goebbels had brought her 6 children with her into the underground shelter as the Soviet forces closed in on Berlin. Helga, Hildegard, Helmut, Holdine, Hedwig. Heidi, the youngest child, was only 4 years old. Witnesses later remembered that Magda appeared calm but deeply convinced that a world without National Socialism was unthinkable. She reportedly told others that her children would not be able to live in a Germany ruled by the enemies of the regime. On May 1, 1945, the tragedy reached its darkest moment. Inside a quiet room of the bunker, Magda Goebbels, with the help of a doctor, gave each of her 6 children cyanide poison. One by one the children died in their beds. Later that same day, Magda and her husband Joseph Goebbels walked into the garden above the bunker entrance, surrounded by the ruins of the Reich Chancellery. There, they ended their own lives. Their bodies were burned as Soviet troops fought their way through the streets of Berlin. Nearby, another chapter of the story had already ended. On the afternoon of April 30, Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun entered a private room inside the bunker. Moments later, a gunshot echoed down the corridor. Hitler had shot himself. Eva Braun had taken cyanide. Following Hitler's instructions, their bodies were carried outside into the garden of the Chancellery and burned. Within days, Soviet forces captured Berlin. The Third Reich was finished. For the remaining women connected to the Nazi leadership, the end of the war brought very different futures. Emmy Göring was arrested by Allied authorities after Germany surrendered. Her husband Hermann Göring was later tried during the Nuremberg trials, where surviving leaders of Nazi Germany faced charges for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Before his scheduled execution, Hermann Göring took poison in his prison cell. Emmy Göring served a period of imprisonment and later lived quietly in Germany for many years. Lena Heydrich, whose husband Reinhard Heydrich had been assassinated earlier in the war, avoided major prosecution after 1945. She eventually returned to northern Germany and lived for decades on the island of Fehmarn, where she operated a small guesthouse. For many survivors of the war, this outcome remained controversial. Her husband had been one of the most powerful figures involved in the machinery of Nazi terror. History rarely offers simple endings. The women, once surrounded by the power and privilege of the Nazi leadership, lived lives shaped by ideology, loyalty, and the men who stood at the center of the regime. Some believed completely in the cause, some remained companions inside a system that rewarded loyalty and punished doubt. And when that system collapsed, their lives became part of the long reckoning that followed the war. Today, photographs from that era still exist. Eva Braun smiling on a sunny terrace in the Bavarian Alps, Magda Goebbels posing with her children, Emmy Göring attending ceremonies beneath enormous banners. The images show elegance and calm, moments when the future still seemed secure, yet behind those pictures lies a deeper lesson. The private lives of powerful people are never separate from the systems they support. Their choices echo far beyond their homes and families, and the story of these women leaves one quiet question that history still asks: how many people living comfortably beside power truly understand the cost of that power until the moment everything collapses around them?